Okay, morning everyone. I think we'll make a start as a few more people trickle in. We can do some intros, get things going. So thanks very much for joining us this morning, and welcome to today's session. So we're looking at looking into supply chain carbon measurement and management for public bodies. And this is it's actually our second webinar within a four-part series that looks across various areas of navigating the net zero transition for cities and regions, which you can see on the title slide there. So really looking forward to sharing some of the content that we've developed today, and also hearing from you as well. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. Today's webinar, it will be recorded, it is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording afterwards so that can be circulated. We have a couple of live polls to gather some thoughts on what we're presenting, and we'll guide you through them when we get to them. We'll make time for Q&A at the end, so please use the built-in Q&A function to pose your questions. Hopefully you can find that easy enough, and we'll get to those questions, as many of those questions as we can before the end. Finally, we'll also circulate a very short feedback survey at the end. Really appreciate your input into it, if possible. Please just take a minute to fill that in if you can. Okay, so just a little bit on the webinar series that we're doing. If you didn't know, we've arrived at the second session of as I said, a four-part series. Been looking at different strategies, different areas that public bodies perhaps should be considering in terms of the transition towards net zero. Today we're talking about supply chains. You can access a recording to our session on place-based local action from the 25th of June, which you'll be able to find at the end. We'll send a link around to that. But also there are sessions coming up on heat networks on the 24th of July, and another session on renewable energy on the 7th of August. So we'll also share a link to that at the end for you to sign up. Looking forward to see you there. Okay, just a little bit about who we are at Carbon Trust. So we're a mission-driven organization, and we aim to accelerate the move to a decarbonized future. We've got 20 years plus experience pioneering in many climate change areas, working with a whole host of different organizations, businesses, governments, but lots of public bodies as well. We work on all things sort of strategy, action planning, and implementation when it comes to net zero. Aim is to be your expert guide around turning climate ambition into impact, and our work very much, it tries to be realistic as well for our clients, ultimately seeking smarter and a more holistic net zero transition solutions. So the webinar series is being brought to you by our cities and regions team. We work predominantly, almost exclusively, with public bodies. We've also been working for over 20 years with governments, public sector bodies, and that spans across a big chunk of public bodies in the UK in particular, which you can see on the slide there. In terms of supply chain, we support national central government departments and bodies on approaches to dealing with supply chain carbon. We also work one-to-one with public bodies, sort of tailored support projects, trying to sort of accelerate that journey for individual public bodies. But we also work with the supply chains that public bodies work with, so we can leverage our experience, the vast experience of working with those private organizations, particularly around GHG accounting. We also work with public bodies around designing in sort of carbon management into procurement mechanisms as well, with the idea to align that area of emissions with moving towards a net zero, and trying to ensure that public money is being spent in the least carbon intensive way possible as well. So quickly introduce myself. I haven't done that yet. So my name is Rob Hatcher. I'm a Associate Director at the Carbon Trust in our Cities and Regions team, the team I've just introduced. And I'm joined by Theo Solway, who you can see on the screen there. And he'll introduce himself a bit later and then talk about his experiences of working on supply chain measurement and mitigation at Newport City Council. So looking forward to hear about that. Okay, so agenda. Briefly, we're going to look at what are supply chain or scope 3 and supply chain emissions, really just to set the scene to the rest of the presentation. Then I'm going to briefly look at approaches to measuring supply chain emissions, and then dive a bit deeper into supply chain engagement. And within that, there'll be more on supply chain emissions measurement and a bit on mitigation as well. And as I say, going to pass over to Theo to talk about his experiences at Newport at the end, and we'll leave hopefully a good amount of time to get into some questions as well. So let's get into the first section. What are scope 3 and supply chain emissions? So on the screen, you can see a sort of reproduction of the categories as found within the GHG protocol. And the GHG protocol, if you're not familiar, is really the main framework that the vast majority of organizations follow when conducting carbon emissions accounting. And beyond emissions that relate to direct sources from your organization and those that largely come from sort of grid-drawn electricity or purchased energy, the blue boxes down the bottom represent the 15 possible categories that the GHG categorizes the scope 3 emissions into. So all the additional indirect emission sources there. Key public body scope 3 hotspots include purchased goods and services, capital goods, upstream transportation and distribution. And these are often grouped together and called supply chain, but that's not specifically a term under the GHG protocol. But there are other quite key scope 3 emission categories for public bodies: waste from operations, fuel and energy related activities, business travel, upstream leased assets, but also downstream leased assets, employee commuting, possibly investments as well. These are really the main and largely the bulk of scope 3 emissions. But these sort of colloquial supply chain emissions, which I'll talk about within that sort of aggregated categorization, these often account for 70% plus of a public sector body's emissions. So hence the focus today. And really, in some instances, we see 80–90% of the emissions sitting in that area, depending on who you are and what you do specifically. So just to add a little bit more around that, many organizations will have a significant proportion of their emissions upstream, sat with their suppliers or their tier 1 suppliers, immediate suppliers, and then potentially the suppliers of those suppliers. So hence what I mean by upstream. And it may be embodied within the products or the materials. And this is the case for public bodies. This is the case for some other industries, some of the industries that we work with here. This is some data from the dairy industry, plastics, leather. A lot of that, their emissions sit upstream of them. But there are other industries such as electronics, automotive, fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG, sort of clothing. A lot of those emissions will sit downstream of the reporting organization. So it's useful to be aware of that as well. And this, I guess, is all a sort of a matter of perspective here, really, or put it another way, it's important to where it's determined by who the reporting organization is, of course. Hopefully that makes sense. And just to add a little bit more color before moving on. On screen is a recent example of a local authority supply chain assessment. This is a sort of a tree map output, sort of in proportion, and you can see the split of key or top emissions sources from that local authority. sort of classified as more in sort of economic procurement categories, but nonetheless gives you an idea where the carbon is initially estimated to sit. But the key takeaway from this really is that public bodies' main Scope 3 emissions generally come from their supply chain, which means that those emissions are sitting with their suppliers and suppliers of their suppliers. Very little is downstream of you as a public body. So evaluating these in more detail and understanding understanding them where they are is the first step in tackling these more proactively. Okay, moving on to now, just briefly before we move on to the next section, do you want to pause for a poll? It's just a question we're going to shoot to you within the built-in Zoom function. It's actually a pretty straightforward question. Hopefully you can see this coming up now. So the question is your organization currently estimating its supply chain emissions, i.e. Some measurement related to purchased goods and services, capital goods, and upstream transportation and distribution? So if you can have a crack at that question, it's yes, no, partially, and I don't know. And we'll just leave a few seconds there to see those responses come in. Okay, I'm gonna push the button on that one and see. Hopefully we'll be able to see what the responses are. Okay, great. So bit of a mix, actually. Bit of a mix. The majority is yes, but it's certainly not the vast majority. We've got a whole mix of the other responses. So no and partially, and about a quarter of people who've answered don't actually know. So it's interesting and actually helps us as we talk through the rest of the presentation as well. A bit of context and hopefully useful for you to see what others on the call are doing right now. So moving on, I'm just going to very briefly introduce doing supply chain emissions measurement. So there's a variety of ways to estimate or calculate supply chain emissions, and using supplier specific data is really the kind of the panacea where this all needs to get to. It's really going to be the most accurate. But what that means is that you're needing to effectively obtain data from a supplier, not just one supplier. It would be all of your suppliers to have a really comprehensive view of this. So that's obviously fairly challenging. Going down to the bottom of this list, so this is kind of a hierarchy you're seeing here on the screen. The spend-based method it's really the entry point, but it's a good place to start in terms of measuring emissions. And this approach really utilizes proxies effectively. So it gives you a good screening, but there are limitations in terms of specificity, accuracy. It's difficult to use that measurement approach for tracking trends and forecasting and showing progress. So transitioning towards that supplier-specific data is really important to more accurately determine the footprint and to be able to show actual progress. You've got these kind of stepping stone methods in between. Here they're laid out as an average data method, which is using some sort of specific data in some instances with some secondary emission sources, and a hybrid method as well, which is kind of a combination of supplier specific data and secondary data to fill the gaps. So you'll see this laid out like this. You'll see it laid out in other ways. In some instances it's laid out sort of in 3 different stages. I've seen it laid out in 5 or 6 stages. But I find this comes from the GHG protocol. It's sort of reproduced from the GHG protocol here. I find it's a useful way, a starter for 10, to sort of get your head around the fact that there are different ways to measure it. And the idea is that you're moving gradually towards a higher precision and accuracy as you do that. But it means you're kind of iterating and reevaluating emissions as you go forward. Okay, So another poll quickly before we move on to supply chain engagement. So related to what I've just gone over there, it'd be great if you could answer if your organization is measuring its supply chain emissions, which measurement method best describes the current assessment approach. So we've got, I can see on the poll there, the top choice hasn't actually come up, unfortunately. But we've got the 4 choices of if you are actually measuring the supply chain emissions. So cost-based proxies, and then average sort of emission factors, utilizing some supplier specific with a mix, and then mostly using supplier specific data. So basically the kind of the 4 areas that I've just presented above. I'll just leave it a second to let people finalize that. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so we've got 56% mostly using cost-based proxies. That's not hugely surprising, but I think interesting to see that we are seeing some organizations 30% using supplier data with a mix of average, and some supplier specific data there as well. So that's great to see, and yeah, also helpful for us, and hopefully useful for yourselves to see that as well. Okay, jumping into supply chain engagement. So engaging with suppliers, it's a really useful lever that you can pull. It can of course help you to, well, the idea is to acquire better data and info around carbon emissions. But it's also, really helps you to gain insights into what your suppliers are doing, what are they doing regarding their own decarbonisation journey, and the whole process. It hopefully, as you'll see, really begins to lift a veil on the way forward about how to decarbonize your supply chain. So it's a really key area to begin to think about if you haven't already. A supplier engagement program or process, as we see it, or as we've kind of laid out in this presentation, it really aims to sort of prioritize the key suppliers, and then obviously you're trying to improve the quality of that footprint and drive reductions. We've broken down the approach here into 3 stages: identify, engage, and collect the data, and then reduce the emissions, which I'll go through now each individually. But all of this really needs to be underpinned by integrating better carbon management into procurement processes, into the purchasing processes as well. So that kind of runs along the whole kind of thread. So starting with identifying key suppliers. So what's the aim? The aims are really to prioritize suppliers, to include in the engagement, of course, but also then to kind of refine what that engagement strategy needs to look like. What does the approach actually look like when you're talking to these suppliers? The starting point is very likely to be your spend data. So we can see, at least more than half of you are doing sort of spend-based accounting. And so you have conducted a sort of a high-level Scope 3 footprint. And so we would call that perhaps a materiality assessment to start with. It gives you a really good idea around where emissions are currently estimated to be. But in prioritizing suppliers to talk to, it's also useful to think about some other qualitative considerations as well. So the main mechanism is this sort of materiality assessment. So in this instance, using these economic proxies, converting spend data for specific sectors into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And there are sort of publicly available emission factors that can take pounds or estimate carbon from pounds that are usable these days. And effectively, what you end up with there is a good initial idea, but it does have quite a bit of uncertainty involved in it. And as I mentioned, it can't necessarily be relied on long term, but it does give you those initial hotspots And so an outcome of this sort of assessment will often show you that a small number of key suppliers account for a chunk of the emissions if you're able to allocate emissions per supplier with the data that you have. And this provides you with this natural prioritization really to start with. It sets the scene to engage with these high emitting suppliers. Perhaps not the only thing you need to consider, however, but the graph on the slide there just shows illustratively, that perhaps only a handful of suppliers are covering, a big chunk of the emissions. So alongside that, that screening, that materiality view, generally advisable to think about a few qualitative sort of questions. And that assessment might include questions like, will that supplier continue to be a supplier for us? Will they remain a key supplier if we're starting at that point? What's that supplier's sustainability maturity? If we don't know that, what questions do we need to find out? What data do we already have? What influence do we have over them? Perhaps the business, you as a customer, are quite a big customer to that organization, which might indicate you have a bit more influence over what they're doing. Perhaps they're a very large organization, and what they're selling you is a very small proportion of their overall kind of bottom line. All interesting things to consider. But the output of doing something like this it is to further refine a list of suppliers, a very short list of suppliers, and you can see a kind of a maturity matrix there, which basically just kind of the idea is to if you've got kind of limited time and resource, which you may well do, it may be that you can only really engage with one or two suppliers to start with. And so this sort of exercise in terms of your ability to influence and their own maturity might help you pin down that one or two suppliers. And it may not be the ones that are right at the top of the list. It may be that they're a bit further down, but it makes more sense to engage with them for a more impactful engagement overall. Okay. So the aims of, so stepping on to stage 2, the aims of data collection is to really engage with those suppliers to get the data, or try to move towards acquiring the right sort of data. Obviously also, as I mentioned, try and get more information on their targets, more information around their net zero journey as well. However, there is still work to do with and when acquiring that data. There are pitfalls and risks with that emissions data. So it does still need to be assessed and QA'd, and you need to be careful around the integration of that data into your footprint. There are a multitude of ways in which you can go out and engage with suppliers. And I think Theo will probably get into this a little bit more in terms of what's happened at Newport. But a typical approach might look like the procurement managers are engaging with the supplier contracts, the account managers, joined by sustainability professionals. You're having an intro meeting, providing the context in terms of what you're doing and the need to collaborate. And you're ultimately looking to obviously gain some data, but if you're not able to get the 100% correct data, then some form of proxy data or other information related to their own carbon management maturity. And the outcomes of doing this really, I think it's a shared understanding with suppliers of the long-term goal, and obviously an initial assessment of their carbon maturity, and ideally the right sort of data, but it may not necessarily be always that easy to acquire. And this engagement is, I think it should be seen as not necessarily all about that quantitative data. It's about communication. It's opening up the door for collaboration with the supplier. It's a shared problem. It's not us and them really. So that need to kind of collaborate and work together starts with this sort of open comms around hopefully a shared understanding around what needs to happen in terms of decarb. So just what data are we actually talking about here? So going back to the emissions approaches I put up earlier, ideally suppliers have high accuracy assessment of their services and products, and that doesn't include lots of proxies. but in many instances, they might only know their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions data. That might be sufficient, but it may be that that's only a proportion or part of the picture. So using these sort of hierarchy of calculation approaches to kind of categorize and communicate with the supplier can be helpful. And in reviewing that data when you get it, there are a few things to note. Ideally figures, they've got that kind of high accuracy there. They've got some sort of verification in them. They're perhaps a life cycle carbon assessment, product carbon footprint, or an environmental product declaration. These are all kind of formal assessments around product carbon footprinting and are probably third-party verified. That's great, but certainly not ubiquitous in any way. If all that is accessible is their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, then there's going to be some high uncertainty in there. Less uncertainty will be present with perhaps more service-based emissions, which are more prevalent with public sector supply chain, because the emissions are largely with the tier 1 supplier and less is upstream. Another consideration, that if you're getting Scope 1 and 2 data from the supplier, is that representative? Perhaps that Scope 1 and 2 data you have covers the whole organization, but actually the service or the product that you specifically purchased is only a proportion of that. So thinking about that relativity, that representativeness is important. So a key warning, supplier data isn't necessarily better. There are pitfalls in using this data, so care does need to be taken when using this information. So where new and improved data is acquired, this can supersede the previous emissions measurement you've got. So that's great. Few other things to note. A key challenge can arise around reporting period inconsistencies. So if you've got inconsistent accounting periods, adjustments may need to be made, and this should obviously be tracked as well. Rebaselining is another consideration here. If the new data that you've acquired means that there's a significant shift in the overall baseline footprint that you've got, a baseline adjustment exercise may need to be conducted. What significant means in this context is going to be specific to the organization. Generally, we would try to advise setting out parameters before what is significant, before the fact, and that can be helpful, perhaps through some sort of rebaselining policy. But the process, if you are going to go down that road, this is sort of theoretical, but it would look something like this. You've got your initial cost-based footprint, 2019 in this instance, and you've acquired some more information from a supplier down the line, and those latter figures, say 2023, they show that the 2019 figures they were too high because of the proxy measurement that's been used, and you've got more specific data now. It's not that you've had a reduction, or at least the reduction that is shown is what we call a false reduction. It's more of an accounting thing rather than an actual reduction in carbon. So what you might need to do is, using that data, you've effectively got access to data to restate the baseline. And in this instance, yes, it shows that there is a lower adjusted initial baseline. But actually, that's not always the case. It can go up as well. I think some organizations maybe believe that as you go up that hierarchy of higher precision data, it's always going to go down, but that's not necessarily the case. So do be aware of that as well. And then finally, just in terms of step 3, the aims are obviously you're wanting to encourage suppliers to help them reduce their emissions and influence wider change. We focused on I focused so far a lot on the measurement side of things here, but of course there's a huge amount of things that can be done to integrate robust carbon management into procurement mechanisms and purchasing procedures and decisions. This is a long-term process. it's potentially a sensible target to move through steps 1 and 2 over a year or two, depending on your resource and your appetite and your targets, of course. But it may be that engaging with suppliers in earnest, you can't necessarily do it all in one go. And another consideration here is that this is very much a cyclical kind of iterative process as well. But there are many ways to integrate carbon management into procurement processes. The example on the screen here shows a sort of a staged approach to integrating carbon management with a public body we worked with. This initially focused on supporting the organisation get the suppliers' carbon reduction plans into the sort of the requirements of the public tendering. To be honest, the really high impact stuff was found when integrating scoring for low carbon delivery of certain contracts, and then including specific carbon KPIs into contracts of certain thresholds, and then ultimately in the future requiring the use of more formal carbon accounting mechanisms like LCAs and product carbon footprints into quite high value contracts. So yeah, if it's something that you'd like to talk to us about, then please do reach out. We can certainly help with that. So I'm going to just close off now before handing over to Theo. So supplier engagement, it's a really key enabler to public sector supply chain decarb. But no one size fits all. It's really difficult to do this, particularly when you're first getting going, and we've seen this a lot. It's trying to come up with a tool or an approach that's going to solve it all in one go. But actually, even at a specific sector level, it's quite hard to do this, let alone at looking at your whole supply chain and trying to do something. So it does take time, and these engagement strategies need to be tailored to certain sectors depending on your supplier base. We've introduced an overall approach, and there's some risks to be made aware of, and these need to be tailored as well. And there's really no need to stick rigidly to sort of the approach that we've laid out today. This is just some ideas around some processes that can be taken. This isn't a one-time thing, as I mentioned. Supplier engagement, it needs to be iterative, improved, evolved over time. Your approach in a couple of years' time will look different to what it does now, and then it may be that you're bringing in fresh tranches of suppliers and starting from perhaps from the beginning with them. And finally, dedicated and specialist resource. We've seen that obviously the organisations that have managed to push this along, they have somebody working on this, a lot of their time, potentially full time even. But also a key thing is the relationships. This needs to be a good relationship between the procurement professionals, the sustainability professionals within an organisation, with the suppliers themselves, but also that there's some specialist sort of technical areas in here as well. So capacity building and collaboration and getting support is really important as well. Okay, I will pass over to Theo. I think it's time to move on, and he is going to talk about his experiences working at Newport City Council. So thanks, Theo. Over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Fantastic overview. Really great to be here today. Just trying to go on to the next slide. Oh, it's gone too far ahead. Right, so I'm Theo Solway from Newport City Council, working on business decarbonisation in the climate change team. If anyone's got any questions for Rob, myself, please do feel free to leave them in the chat, and we will try to answer as many questions as we can. But yeah, so I'll go through my experiences at Newport, what we're doing and how we're working with our supply chain. So my role really is around working with businesses, private sector, and supply chain organizations. Obviously, this is a national issue. We have to get to net zero by 2030 as a public sector body, and then our wider city of Newport needs to get to net zero by 2050. So it requires a huge amount of collaboration and engagement. And a recent report that was conducted by the Welsh Government Energy Service stated that huge majority of our emissions stem from the things we purchase, the products and the goods we purchase. And in our last full reporting period of 22-23, the one that's been sent off to Welsh Government last September, 80% of our emissions stem from scope 3. And as you can see, It's primarily from, as an organization, it's waste, it's supply chain, it's business travel, and it's buildings and fleet. Now, that is something that's pretty consistent across many organizations, many public sector bodies, but we have identified our procurement as a major sort of carbon hotspot for us that needs addressing. Just go to the next slide. For us as a council, as you can see, these are the top 5 emitting categories for us, and just re-emphasizes that Scope 3 is a huge issue for us, as it's indirect, as Robert stated, that we don't have direct control over it, so we need collaboration, we need to work with businesses. And as you can see, I've done some work with the Science Based Target Initiative Net Zero Pathway tool to see what's our baseline year of 2019, net zero figure of 2030, how we need to get there, how many tons of carbon do we need to reduce annually, and that sort of, then you can allocate carbon budgets per service area, per category. And as you can see, currently, the last period, we are at our forecasted emissions, which is great, but the going is really going to get tough now as we look at our own assets, procurement, and waste. I'll go to the next slide, which looks at the forecast versus performance for our purchased goods and services. Now, as you can see, there's been a drastic reduction in the last 2 reporting periods due to the changes in the DEFRA conversion factors, which was good for us, but we still need to drive that emission reduction by just over 2.5 kilotons per annum to get to net zero, to meet our 2019 baseline targets. So you've had an overview of what sort of Scope 3 is, and I imagine many of you on the call will be proficient in Scope 3 accounting and financial accounting, but if you're not, this is a real sort of high-level overview of what is needed to get this data in terms of spend-based proxies, so the one right at the bottom. So in terms of what we do, we have full financial expenditure across the reporting period, the 12-month period, and our CRM portal, Atomis, allows us to produce and export reports outlining total expenditure. What's really important is the use of the SIC codes, the Standard Industrial Classification Codes, as each business and each supplier has an SIC code attributed to it. Now, they are a framework of collecting and presenting large-scale statistical data according to economic activity. And in our carbon reporting calculations, each SIC code has a conversion factor attributed to it when calculating spend-based methodology. So if you can see the example below that I put in, it would state, supplier name, SIC code, category, in this case is machinery and equipment, which the SIC code is 28. Total expenditure is £10,000. There's the conversion factor. You multiply them both together to give you total CO2e in kilograms for that supplier. Now, that is what we do and how we report to Welsh Government, but I really wanted to delve deeper last year and really see what we could do to get actual data from supply chain to drive emissions reduction. So we need to get to net zero. We need to work with our businesses, and how we do that is exactly what Robert was stating, to work with those suppliers and analyze our expenditure, analyze our carbon emissions from supply chain, and see who are the carbon hotspots and highest emitters in our supply chain. So I underwent a large project of carbon accounting, financial data analyzing, and we saw that adult services, construction, HR were the top 3 in terms of procurement expenditure. So that's where much of the efforts needed to be placed. And further to that, 39 of our 3,000 plus suppliers accounted for the top 50% of our expenditure. So that really highlighted a need to work with those businesses, ask for their carbon reduction plans, any support they have available, any data they had, what their long-term planning is, what supplier are they to us. That was great. That was sort of a fantastic process. I met with them, face to face at their offices, phone calls, emails. That was great. However, engaging with the small businesses and the SMEs within our supply chain did present various challenges. These businesses lacked exposure to emissions reporting, and they really lacked information and guidance. So I really thought there's a great opportunity here to engage with these businesses, provide tailored guidance and support, and engagement is so crucial in addressing these challenges. So what I did in Q1 of last year was developed a carbon calculator based on the GHG protocol, Welsh Government, UK Government conversion factors, and just placed it in a different spreadsheet where it was more user-friendly, it was engaging for small businesses, but also really useful for large corporates. And that really empowered our small businesses that we worked with to say, right, just put in your electricity consumption, your gas consumption, your scope 1, scope 2, any fuels you use, business travel. Then we go into scope 3. I work with them to identify what categories we need to omit from the 15 scope 3 categories and which ones we need to highlight and work on. And that toolkit, that calculation, has been rolled out to all suppliers with spend of over 75K, most of which are SMEs. So in terms of the results and the progress from that, 22 of the top suppliers provided scope 1 and scope 2 data at a minimum, but many provided all 3 scopes. We managed to account for over 110 million pounds worth of NCC spend, public spend, with just over 100 suppliers. And this has really enabled me to work with businesses to measure their carbon footprints for their contract and for their organization. So really supporting them to not only decarbonize a contract with us, but their entire organization. And how this has trickled down to legislation and policy within Newport City Council is that I've worked really closely with our service manager for procurement, because internal collaboration is key to drive these changes. So as of Q2 of last year, all suppliers with new or renewed contracts of over £75,000 are required to report on their emissions for the duration of the contract. This is pivotal to ensure that we embed something at the beginning of a contract so we can then work with businesses. They are legislatively required to decarbonize. We are we're committing to say we want to support you to get to net zero, and you need our support, we need your support, essentially. And that was really key for us to put that into the procurement process from sort of day one, essentially, with new and renewed contracts. So just go to the next slide. Low carbon tendering is a huge it's a variable that we can control, I think, because we lay out the specification. And what I do is I consult on a variety of tenders, reviewing specifications, liaising with project managers, researching climate risks and opportunities relevant to the industry and to the sector where a tender has been written. Based on this, I recommend additional questions to be included in the tender alongside a standard set of carbon questions that go out to all tenders. This is not intended to cause apprehension among suppliers, but rather to gain insight into their reporting policies, their readiness for future requirements, and it aims to be both beneficial for us and businesses. It's really important that we do this from the outset of contracts. We look at things like construction. How can we start to require, environmental product declaration, EPDs, in contracts? How can we work with businesses to source low carbon alternatives? And a huge factor that I'm looking at lately is life cycle assessments and embodied carbon assessments, and how we can start to require those in construction contracts over a certain value. I think that that's really important to work with suppliers and sit down from day one and state, if you provide your bill of quantities with a infrastructure project, I will put it into a carbon model, work with you. We can see that 80% of the carbon emissions is from the cement used. How can we source low carbon cement? Are there local providers for this? Can we reduce the transportation distribution emissions? And it really is a collaborative effort that, you commit day one to work with us across the design stage, across the installation stage, and then end of life, how we can work on construction contracts to decarbonize that. I think it's a really important tool we can start to leverage. So for us at Newport, this is business as usual. We are now setting strategic emissions reduction targets with businesses. I've worked with the private sector to write carbon footprint assessments, carbon reduction plans for over 5, 6, 7 large corporates and SMEs alike in Newport. A huge collaboration that I take part in is the South East Wales collaboration. I sit on a few procurement boards and subgroups, and we really streamline and ensure that we work together to input sustainable procurement practices across the region, as there will be many suppliers with contracts with multiple local authorities. So we need to ensure standardization, and that's really key to work across the piece with different local authorities, different public sector bodies, conduct analysis on our mutual suppliers, and then provide tailored support from multiple organizations, because specialist support is required for this. And essentially, along with data collection, building strong relationships with large corporates and SMEs has been the foundation and the key to what we're doing at Newport. And if you do want to get in touch, please do, call me, email the wider climate change team or Newport City Council. More than happy to provide support, work with you, and answer any questions. But yeah, really appreciate the chance to speak today. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Theo. It's really useful, and yeah, great to hear about the work there. Sounds really impactful.
Excellent.
So we're going to move on. We've got a little bit of time for a bit of Q&A. A few questions here, so I'll just get us going. First one is what sort of response do you get from suppliers when doing supplier engagement? Maybe I can take that one. I'll pass over to you as well, Theo. I think it depends. It depends, but typically from the engagement that you get with suppliers is often very positive, and the suppliers are keen to help and hear more. It's either that they're more or less on top of things or can see where things need to go, or they want some support to help them move forward. One key piece of feedback I've seen is there is a need for clarity. They know they need to do this stuff in general, but perhaps better info on the what and the when. When this stuff needs to be done by as well. Setting out some timelines can be really helpful. But there's a variation within sectors and with size of organization as well. That SMEs can be a bit trickier for obvious reasons. So yeah, I don't know, Theo, how forthcoming have suppliers been when they've asked you to provide data in the last year or so, from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely great question. I think it's like you said, it's a mix. It's definitely a mix between some suppliers who this is really at the forefront of their mind. They understand that different local authorities and public sector will be requiring this for large contracts and then bringing this down to smaller contracts. But for suppliers who are not quite as forthcoming, it's really about how you frame the conversation. So I really do say, this is a chance to get free support, to get ahead of the market. These are requirements that may be scored in future contracts and future tenders across the public sector. So engaging now will put you in a really advantageous position, essentially. And I also state that there's going to be different funding pots coming around to decarbonize social care, to decarbonize construction, and having your carbon reduction plan and your carbon footprint done now will position you in a fantastic place to win bids, to win contracts. So it's really about how you frame it with suppliers who aren't as interested in engaging now. And I state that it's the way that businesses are going. If you don't adapt in business, the reality is you may be left behind. So working with us now to provide free support and guidance is a fantastic opportunity, I think. But yeah, great question. I've just seen another question in the chat. I've just answered one on the chat with my email, so more than happy to respond to any questions via email. But from Roberta, how do you deal with suppliers who may have multiple SIC codes? Yeah, great question. That is a real issue that we face at Newport, where we work with a supplier that has an incorrect SIC code in some cases. So I think that in that case, I would see where the majority of our spend is with that supplier, and then which SIC code is the most relevant to that SIC code. But if it's possible to look at spend across different categories with a large business, then it might be beneficial to drop that SIC code down and really get high level information from that business. Say, right, we spent X amount of money on their transport service, X amount on their construction service, and X amount on their delivery service. So it's really about engaging with suppliers and sitting down with them and saying exactly what are we paying for, and can you provide contract specific emissions across different spends. That's where engagement's key, because if we're just going to use SIC code emissions, then we're not going to get the accurate data that we need. The next question is, are you collecting product data from EPDs, and how do you report as part of its scope 3 emissions? So I have collected EPD data really recently for an infrastructure project, but it was post infrastructure project. It was more of a research piece where I worked with a large construction company to write it, to ask for their bill of quantities, get the data, get the transport data, and then look at the embodied carbon for that contract. That's something that we're going to put into contracts over the coming years, and it's not something that we've done at the minute in terms of putting into our scope 3 emissions spreadsheet calculations sort of as yet. How are contracts and KPIs monitored to ensure reporting in Newport? That's the main thing. It's all great putting this at the tender process, but if there's no contract management, monthly review, 6 monthly review, annual review to state, are you actually achieving what you stated? Then it's really not going to have much value. So I think that's where continuous meeting with suppliers, looking at who your top suppliers are, putting in, like Robert stated, written, audited minutes across what we're trying to do with when you meet with businesses is really key. And it's just ensuring that what they stated at the contract is deliverable and can be deliverable, and meeting them, really regularly to ensure that that is the case. And with local government resources and budgets stretched to the limit, who processes the supply data in Newport? So that's me. And like Robert said, it is a really intensive piece of work, and it is something that typically one member of staff or a team do. And I think we're really fortunate at Newport, where my role is funded through the Shared Prosperity Fund to work on business and private sector decarbonisation. So it's been great for me to just work on that. But you are right, especially with procurement officials, this does tend to sit with them sometimes, and procurement officials have a lot to do already. So this is an added pressure, but that's really where coming together and allowing different sections of your organization to work on different pieces is really key.
Thanks, Theo. Hopefully that's useful for everyone. Just picking up on one other one. What proportion of suppliers have kind of ready to go sort of high quality emissions data? I guess I can comment on that quickly, see what you think as well, Theo. But again, I'd say it's difficult to say sort of comprehensively for all public bodies or all public sector supply chains. But we do see certain sectors having higher maturity in this space than others. I think Theo's probably mentioned, I think, construction, and there's been a lot of movement with the construction sector even over the last 10 years. There's even some standards that are being followed, PAS 2080, particular carbon management in construction or infrastructure at least. Waste, IT, certainly these are sort of, you see a lot more traction. It may be even that some of these organizations are publishing their product carbon footprints on their websites, which can be a great resource to look at. I think Dell is a good example. You can go on their website and pull down a product's carbon footprint for the laptop you've just bought, for example, which takes a lot of the pain out of this, which is great. But there's other areas of sort of public sector supply chains, social care, sort of the residential side, nursing, that sort of stuff. It's more tricky. Perhaps the emissions profile of these areas are less complex, but actually the organizations are much more dispersed. So getting the information out of them, getting the right sort of more primary information out of these organizations can be quite challenging. And it comes back to that sort of supplier engagement and the sort of the collaboration and working with them to be able to acquire that better information. I don't know if Theo, you got any further thoughts on that?
No, I just want to say, really do second that. Nothing really to add to that. Fantastic.
Okay.
Just see another question, Rob, for you on upskilling and carbon accounting. I think it's a great question. I just want to jump in really quickly on that. I wanted to mention,
sure.
I've done carbon literacy training, found that to be pretty relevant, but definitely IEMA. So I recently I'm a full member of IEMA and a chartered environmentalist with them, but I've also done a bit of training on carbon footprinting and accounting. And I do think that really gives organizations, both public and private, a really good high level overview of exactly what Scope 1, Scope 2, and 3 are, how you calculate it, the different Scope 3 calculations, how they are relevant to different organizations and their structure. And I think that's, I really found that was a really fantastic resource.
Yeah, thanks, Theo. That's good to hear. I think it depends. I think the question is probably coming from sort of getting into it into more depth. So carbon literacy training is a good place to start. I think it's sort of broader, and it's meant to try and sort of cover anyone in say a public body to kind of sort of upskill a little bit around it. So the IEMA stuff, I think, is a good place to go if you're looking to get into more depth. There's some resources on the sort of the GHG protocols website as well. Getting into reading the Scope 3 guidance and the Scope 3 technical guidance as well is a good place to kind of upskill. Another good resource that I know is useful as well, if you haven't seen, is called the Supply Chain Sustainability School. That is meant for, I think, more focused around procurement professionals, but also sustainability professionals as well. And they produce some really good stuff, some good resources. They recently put out a good guide around, specifically related to what we're talking about today, but around HVO and procuring HVO and the considerations related to using HVO, and it may be relevant to, say, some of your suppliers that are working in the transport sector as well. But yeah, they've got some good stuff out there. Okay, I think that's all we've got time for. So let's wrap up. So really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much for your questions as well. Great to have your input on those polls earlier on. So thank you for that. I appreciate your concentration and input. I'm just going to wrap up quickly and just flag our public sector network, which would really welcome you to all join. If you're not members already, you can continue the conversation we've been having today there. I think we'll put up the link to the website there. Sorry, to the recording on the website there as well. And it's really just a great resource for anyone in the public sector to engage and collaborate with peers on all things public sector net zero. And finally, as mentioned at the beginning, we're working through a short series of webinars. We're halfway through now, so you can see the first one on place-based net zero, and then today's one on supply chain. So you can get the recordings of those shortly after this, and then signing up to upcoming webinars on the 24th of July on heat networks from our team as well, and then on the 7th of August on renewable energy as the fourth one there, and there's a QR code there on the screen. So looking forward to seeing you all there, and that's it from us. So thank you all very much for your time. Do take care and keep up the good fight. Thanks very much.